Hi, this is Paul. Had a really wonderful conversation with Cale Zeldin today about the Roman Catholic Church after Francis. It's sort of a way that I can continue to think about the much larger church, the Roman Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, what's happening in the church and the world in this moment that we're in, because it seems like a lot of the very deep assumptions that are built into our shared culture are changing, meaning that how we interact with the church, what our assumptions of the church are, et cetera, are changing and impacting how we live in a big way. And a lot of this has to do with questions of authority. I think Ross Douthat's essay on the death of the Pope was excellent. And during the podcast, I read these paragraphs. In one way, at least, well, I'll just read the first four paragraphs of it. Pope Francis, who passed to his reward on the morning after Easter at age 88, was a version of the liberal Pope that many Catholics had earnestly desired all through the long reign of John Paul II and the shorter one of Benedict XVI. A man whose worldview was shaped and defined by the Second Vatican Council and whose pontificate saw a renewal of its revolution, a further great modernization of the Catholic Church. And I thought Cale was super helpful for me for locating both John Paul II, Benedict XVI, with the human sexuality, the Catholic Human Sexuality Report, we'll call it that way, I'll avoid the Latin, and or human life, and then these assumptions that sort of grew out of Vatican II about, let's say, the trajectory of the narrative arc of the church within modernity in the way that they felt it should go. In one way, at least, he succeeded. For generations, modernizers lamented the outsized power of the papacy, anachronism of a monarchical authority in a democratic age. The way the concept of papal infallibility froze Catholic debates even as the world rushed forward. In theory, Francis shared these concerns, promising a more collegial, horizontally oriented church, more synodical in the jargon of the Catholic bureaucracy. In practice, he often used his power in the same way as his predecessors to police and suppress the deviations from his authority, except that this time the targets were dissenting conservatives and traditionalists instead of progressives and modernizers. One of the things Cale did was draw a relationship between Francis and Trump, which seems like the strangest relationship whatsoever, because Francis would continue to denounce Trump for this and that and this and that. But as in the case where Free Rillian on Twitter has been lamenting my equivalencies are not sort of a complete stack of A to a complete stack of B. There's this element from stack A connects with this element from stack B. This element from stack A compares with this element from stack B. There can be many elements of the stack that by no means match up. I'm not claiming a total top to bottom equivalency, A equals B. I'm saying that there are aspects, and Cale, I didn't see this until Cale said it, there are aspects of where Trump and Francis sort of come together. And I think this is exactly one of them, because in sort of an opposite way, Francis used the power and authority of the papacy against the traditionalists who were the ones who had sort of safeguarded the power of the papacy. That was their thing. I think in some ways what Trump has been doing with respect to dismantling the elements of post-Second World War government and policy, using the government itself to undo the government, or the authority of the government in the eyes of, let's say, people who during the COVID crisis were probably most inclined to simply believe the government. And I think we saw a little bit of that, because I remember during the Trump administration, and what's so interesting is that there's so much interesting amnesia around the Trump administration's performance during COVID, because I can remember Kamala Harris saying she would not take a vaccine that was rushed by the Trump administration. Whereas in people's sort of sides memories, they would say, well, Trump was always an anti-vaxxer. And no, he wasn't. Reality is always way more complex. So now Trump in power changes the government website saying that, well, the COVID vaccine was from a lab leak in Wuhan. And suddenly you see sort of this switch. And so I think Douthit sort of nicely helped me see, and Kale very much filled in details of just why so many conservative Catholics were so upset with Francis. And as a Protestant watching from the other side, I was just watching this and just trying to make sense of this narrative. And so having friends there to sort of explain, well, they're upset because of this. And Douthit just very economically puts it in writing here. But just by creating that novel form of conflict in which Catholics who had been accustomed to being on the same side as the Vatican found themselves suddenly crosswise from papal authority, Francis helped to demystify his office's authority and undermine its most imposing claims. That's because the conservatives whose convictions he unsettled in the last believers in the imperial papacy, the custodians of infallibility's mystique, and by stirring more of them to doubt and disobedience, he kicked away the last major prop supporting a strong papacy and left the office of St. Peter in the same position as most of the 21st century institutions, graced with power but lacking credibility, floated on charisma without underlying legitimacy, with its actions understood in terms of rewards for friends and punishments for enemies. And of course, this is exactly the charge brought against the Trump administration now, and with wild swings in the stock market and back and forth on tariffs, then people are wondering about competency, because often within our culture, competency tends to be there's competency itself is something that is, well, competency is very close to authority. And that's where a lot of these things, that's where a lot of these questions are happening. Is Trump playing four-dimensional chess, or is, what is going on? And again, people's first filters sort of govern in many cases in terms of do they give him the benefit of the doubt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this question of authority is so absolutely critical. Rod Dreher pointed to a piece by Christian Smith. Some of you might not know who Christian Smith is. Christian Smith wrote this book that I refer to often, Soul Searching. Christian Smith is a sociologist who is now teaching at Notre Dame, and he's written a number of, I think, very good books. And he has released one now. Basically, is religion obsolete? Or let's see the title of the book, Why Religion Went Obsolete. And he has a really interesting interview with Ken Woodward. I'll put the link below. There's both a transcript and an audio version of it. In listening to The Rest is History on the French Revolution, one of the interesting things that happens in the French Revolution is that you have the taking apart of the old regime, of the ancient regime, the assumptions about nobility and class and bloodline sort of taken apart and put in an egalitarian way. And how that gets translated, let's say, in the American system is that ideally, in a modernist way, competence is reputation for competence is created by success, predictive success. You can think of Nate Silver predicting the Obama victory, and so suddenly he's seen as a very competent pollster. But then when he predicts the Hillary Clinton victory instead of the Donald Trump victory, then suddenly his competency is questioned. And this other word, this very important word for authority. So we might say something like this. Competency is weather. Meritocracy is weather. Authority is climate. Authority is sort of the big, slow, durable, high-level, governing relationship that affords a first filter, that affords an assumption. And again, back to, I think, one of the really great sound clips from John Vervaeke. Now, this gentleman here is a UK rando. He's been at 2 of my events. He's listened to the videos. He once again comes to me and says, I can't listen to all your videos. And I say, bless you, my son. There's no need to listen to all of my videos. But he lands this question with John Vervaeke that the guy sitting next to him was also at the UK estuary event.
Because in a sense, no matter what I do, and even if I propositionally at some point stop believing what the Catholic Church teaches, in some real sense, I'll still be a Catholic down to my core because it's what I was raised in. And I'm wondering, John, do I still do that going forward? Do I try to raise my kids Catholic? Do I try to hold to that? Because I don't know how I could pass it all on propositionally or philosophically outside of those practices.
There's 2 ways you can.
And again, what Cale said, which was so poignant today, was that if you took snapshots of his mother's first communion in the 50s and Cale's first communion in the 80s, the world changed so much. And the authority climate, I think in many ways, was the massive change. Now, Lucas Van Oss just had a conversation with D.C. Schindler that I definitely have to listen to because it sounds like they addressed this. In the 1950s, the Roman Catholic Church could bring forward, say, we are the church of forever. We are the church of Peter. This is our climate authority. The sea change that happens with the counterculture, and Tom Holland, again, is writing a book on this, and I think his instincts are exactly right. You have to look at this post-World War period. While on one hand, there's this sort of overlay of authority and competency by the New World hegemon, the United States. Democracy wins the Second World War. Underneath, there's something else brewing. And it comes to full flourish in the counterculture. And it's interesting because, I'll see if I can find it in the transcript. For many Americans, religion went from being a nice community thing. It helped raise your children to be moral. To religion is violent. It is the source of evil. It gets people to be extremists, Smith said. And all of that violates everything Americans believe religion ought to be. That happens then with the new atheists. Before, religion was going to help us in the Cold War defeat godless communism. We had God on our side. And suddenly, after the Berlin Wall falls, we have all of these messages often coming from the universities that say, oh no, religion is the source of patriarchy. Religion is the source of violence. Religion has no authority. These are all made up stories just to keep people in control. Scandals among clergy and politicization of evangelical Christianity also drove people to abandon religious institutions. And now again, it's so interesting because Musa al-Gaib, the guy who woke something, We Were Never Woke, very interesting book, basically makes the argument that it's so interesting how evangelicals got tagged as being the first to align themselves with politics when, in many ways, the main line in the political, they were the establishment church in America for the Cold War. It was always political. And, you can look at interesting relationships there. And again, in this book on economics, The Divine Economy, he makes the point again and again that, following Adam Smith, that it's an interesting relationships to the degree that religious institutions and the civil government institutions, when they wed each other, they sort of rise or fall depending on their marriage. And so you see that, let's say, with Franco and the Catholic Church in Spain. And most important of all, in Smith's analysis, the digital revolution transformed society, weakening social structures and altering the nature of our relationships and turning the fissures already forming within denominations into outright fractures. I have to get to the other one. This is Ken Woodward. Obviously, this is an inversion of the morality taught by traditional American religion, but isn't it possible that this total transformation in sexual mores and lack of shame might trigger some kind of turn towards a more traditional view of human sexuality? Basically, what Christian Smith had been saying is that he's talking about individualism and neoliberalism. Life is a big marketplace. This is neoliberalism. Life is a big marketplace. Life is a place where you satisfy your consumer desires, and it's also part of emerging adulthood. Before I settle down, I want to explore and be crazy and try a lot of things, and so on, enabled by a technology that didn't exist in the 60s and 70s. Obviously, this is an inversion of the morality taught by traditional American religion, Woodward replies. But it's impossible, but isn't it possible that the total transformation of sexual mores and a lack of shame might trigger some kind of turn towards a more traditional view of human sexuality? I think it already has, according to a small minority. There has been for some decades now a small minority of people who've been through party culture, and they say, you know what? This is empty. I don't want to live like this. So they return to Catholicism, often more traditional versions of Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy. But this is a smallish group, very heavy in the corner, but a smallish group. Most American young people are not doing that. You remember another inversion, again, Woodward, with respect to evangelicals. You write that the actual legacy of the evangelical emphasis on personal salvation, accepting Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, is the standard phrase. Ironically, was been to push Americans away from the church. How so? Christian Smith. They were successful in communicating that phrase to the broader culture, but a lot of people didn't use that to become evangelicals. They started using that discourse to explain why they don't need to go to church. I have a personal relationship with God in my living room or in my yoga studio. I don't need a religious congregation. I don't need the denomination or organization or the Vatican. I just do it, me as an individual with God. That's part of the notion of spirituality. So the irony is the discourse evangelicals use to emphasize a certain way of being a Christian was adopted by others using the exact same discourse to justify why they don't need to be part of a church at all. Evangelicals certainly didn't intend to do that. It's a totally unintended consequence. You write, and this is devastating, that religion became obsolete because of its own fossilized cultural forms that it was unable to shake. Christian Smith. That's what it looks like to me sociologically. And this is where Cale and I sort of ended the conversation, there's this sort of trap where you can't just go back to climate authority, the authority in the climate of the church, if that authority is gone. And people down in the weather layer keep pointing to it, but it's like, it's not there. You feel whether authority is just the accumulation of all the instantiations of weather. I know Google's going to put a little disclaimer here because I said climate how many times. Even though, I mean, this happened with when I talked about new atheism being AIDS, and I got an AIDS disclaimer on the video. This stupid AI. How do we form authority? How does this grow? Because again, if my feelings, if I'm living down here in weather, but climate is sort of governing, well, it takes a huge accumulation of weather to sort of create climate. Or, actually, more practically, the climate creates the weather.
Be asking that question. You can be asking that question sort of like as a challenge or a theoretical, or you could be asking that question as if you're wanting advice from me. Which is it?
It's more the first. But if you have anything on the second, I'll take it.
I don't want to take the role of the second. One of the things I consistently practice and not just say is, and this is because a lot of people say this to me, is if the work I do helps people to return to a religious home, and that's the right way of thinking about it, a religious home, great. I want to ameliorate the suffering, the hunger of the meaning crisis. I'm not trying to win a particular social cause, right? And so, okay, what the research shows is that people are not, I know this is going to fly in the face of what people want to hear. So this is scientific work done by atheists. Just to be clear, okay? The thing that makes you a theist or an atheist is not how analytic your thinking is, or how emotional or intuitive your thinking is, contrary to what we believe. In fact, there are weird correlations. Your country is one of the weird correlations. It's usually the United States that's the weird correlation. But the UK is the weird correlation in that religiosity and analytic thought are actually positively correlated with each other, which is contrary to the typical atheist story that people are religious because they're not capable of good analytic reflective thought. That's not what drives what religion people take up, or if they become atheists or not, contrary to what we like to tell ourselves in our own ego-stroking autobiographies. What is the most overwhelming predictor, and it's not poverty or other things we've been told since the Enlightenment, the overwhelming predictor is, what are the people in your life that you regard as credible? And this has a specific meaning, which means they do what are called credibility-enhancing displays, which is the following. They do something that you don't understand, but because you trust them and you've seen their wisdom, you are willing to imitate them to see if they can open your eyes to something. And before you think that's stupid, that's how kids work. Because that's our biggest advantage over chimps, is we trust our adults way more. And that's how come we're capable of culture. So what predicts what your kids will be is the degree to which you do credibility-enhancing displays that they don't initially understand, but they are willing to imitate because they trust and love you, that will actually form them. That is my scientific answer to you.
We've only got a couple of minutes left.
The climate level of your authority will obviously be deeply molded by your childhood experiences. But part of what happens developmentally as a child is that it's mom and dad for a long time, but very quickly peers, school, television, media, these things come up. And part of what we're really sensitive to are we will use our words and our actions in order to gain, Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan were talking about, reputation, status, in order to gain reputation and status with each other. And maybe reputation, Rogan was talking status and Peterson kind of said, well, is it more reputation? I don't know. But I love this point in the Veritas forum, this old video that Veritas sort of jealously guards, where Dallas Willard is walking through, tells a story of he's walking through a university with someone, and Dallas Willard just basically instinctively knows that what you say and what you do in that context, in that arena, is going to be shaped by the arena, because you know you're either going to gain or lose status, gain or lose reputation by what you say and do in that arena. And so, again, individuals might be weather. The spirit of the arena is climate. And there's just a whole lot of shaping that goes along. And this is in dynamic play. And we're in one of these positions now where the irony of the situation in the Catholic Church is that this is so in keeping with American culture. The true Catholics are the rebels. And of course, anybody who was raised in Protestantism is sort of looks at that even in a low resolution way, would say, well, that if you're rebelling against the authority of the church, no, the church authority structures have betrayed the true authority of the church. And of course, Protestants are used to this all the time, because that's exactly the move that is made. The CRC didn't leave, I didn't leave the CRC left me. So I'm making my way through the telepathy tapes. And I guess, I didn't know this, Kai, what's her name? Kai Dickens was on Joe Rogan, and I'm sure that's how the telepathy tapes sort of got play in the corner a few months ago. I didn't hear it then. It's a fascinating listen. Clearly a controversial listen. She's very clear that, well, if the mamas of the non-speaking autistic individuals are to be believed, and the autistic speaking, the spellers ought to be believed, then maybe the materialist model of consciousness is all wet. But again, as C.S. Lewis notes in the beginning of his book Miracles, that's not how authority in the climate sense changes. Now, sometimes there's an event where things are changed instantly or challenged instantly, but that authority, that climate level authority, is much more durable. But it's much more durable, but then when it's lost, the changes are far more dramatic. Again, thinking about Rhett's conversation with Alex O'Connor, and when you look at a deconversion or something like that, and even then, there's so much formation that has happened in the person beneath the waterline that the transformation is by no means complete. In the second episode, there was a very interesting moment when they're running through, they're doing these little tests where the speller is over there and the mom is shown something, and immediately when the mom sees it, the speller can spell it out. And the reason that Kai Dickens brings in this cameraman is because she knows he's a skeptic. And now again, sort of this first filter thing. Well, what do you mean a skeptic? Well, a skeptic means that this person is not a believer, and we mean that more broadly. This person, it's like Nacho Libre's little Escalato. I don't remember that's his name. It's the skeleton guy because he's very skinny. I only believe in science, he says. And okay, well, what do you mean? It means that the little boy who cannot speak doesn't know what's on mama's mind. Okay. But then when they go through time and time again, and it's 100%, and again, someone might say the whole thing is a fraud. Could be. It's a fascinating fraud. I'm mostly annoyed by, I had to do a little bit of research in terms of this term telepathy, because knowing a little Greek, it's like, is telepathy the right word? Because it sort of means feeling from afar. Because pathos, pathos, it's not feeling, it's information. somewhat feeling. And I'm not a skeptic. I don't find this hard to believe. I read through Carlos Ayre's They Flew, which I found to be a fascinating book. And I'm not a skeptic about that. And of course, we have T. Grogan here because far be it from us to be a community and not have a skeptic. So we got to, for as long as possible, and he seems pretty durable, we should just sort of make sure that T. Grogan doesn't convert and start believing all the wacko stuff that all of us woo-woo people in the corner believe. But this moment in the second episode was super interesting.
Just explain this. And it's hard for scientists to get research funded in this realm because, as we talked about in episode 1, much of our scientific paradigm is materialism, which more or less says the only things that can be real are things that can be observed and measured. So
now of course, here, Local Distance was on the channel with the Rebel Cell. And what's interesting is that you can use these spirits and put them against each other. And so on one hand, you have the authority of, I only believe in science, versus the Rebel Cell. And which adds, in the counterculture, it adds a cachet. Well, I'm spiritual, but not religious. And so with all of the people no longer going to church, Sam Harris's dream doesn't come because people like Clay Rutledge study the thing and says, well, they still believe in the woo, and they're going to listen to the telepathy takes and say, yeah, that doesn't sound too hard for me. And the believing doesn't really cost them anything. It's probably not going to make any difference in terms of how they actually live their lives. But
scientists who earnestly want to research and look into ESP and telepathy have historically not been given much respect and certainly not money. And Dr. Diane Hennessy.
So there's that. You lose status, you lose reputation if you do this.
Powell has been trying, but there needs to be a ton of research looking into this. And what Manisha says next is...
There needs to be a ton of research looking into this. Why? I'm not saying they shouldn't. I think it would be a totally cool thing to research. I think it's way cooler to research this than what a whole lot of other people are researching. Sounds like a really awesome thing to research. But what exactly are we looking to learn? And what it is that I suspect we're looking to learn is what we want to know is the causal mechanism by which these spellers can read the minds of their mamas and then later on meet at the hill, yada, yada, yada. This is going to go deeper still. But we want to know the causal mechanisms. And then in the podcast, there's a lot of speculation about, Lucille Ball and her dental work helped her tune into the radio, and human beings are electrical, and you can throw in Michael Levin and the electroceuticals and all the discovery they're doing about the electrical network that is the human body, and we can speculate. Maybe something could be found, and we could learn at a deeper level some other causal mechanisms by which... See, part of the reason I'm not terribly skeptical about this is that as a pastor, I hear stories like this all the time. Well, not exactly like this, but someone dies and a family member has an experience. Somehow, at the same time as so-and-so passed away, a distant family member had a thought or a realization or a dream, and they somehow just knew. Now, that's not with the kind of tight, 100% correlation that you hear, at least in these stories here, if in fact they are true. But it's enough evidence that for me to understand that people have connections deeper than the ones that we can sort of track with our current knowledge of radio waves or however people want to construe this thing. That's not a surprising thing to me. The other thing that is interesting is that people, I think, sort of make way more about it than they should. Now, I understand. So in our church, I told this a little bit of this story. When I first got to this church, there was a little boy, a member of a family of this church. The father and mother, there's something going on there that I won't get into just because it's the internet. But anyway, the mom was raising she had her little 5-year-old severely autistic boy and like a 3-year-old daughter. And when I got to this church, the church and the family were just around her in just a beautiful way, supporting. And so that little boy could not be in nursery with any other children. It would be dangerous for the other children in nursery. So there would be a member of the church, a volunteer, who would be out on the playground, the church playground, with the boy and just walking around and just keeping him busy so that his mother could go to church and his little sister could go to nursery. And this church just came around that family in a really beautiful way. But I also know a lot of what many of the testimony of the mothers here, where they talk about, basically people say there's no there inside these kids. And so then to have an understanding that in many cases these children in fact are sort of trapped in their bodies and they're unable to communicate, and through spelling and some other means a link is made, and that they can have a richer connection, and the mothers can have a sense that all of the enormous sacrifice that the mothers have done is worth it, because there's a person in that non-speaking body who sees and cares and loves, and maybe in some small way there can be a connection to the outside world. And even better, that person trapped in that non-speaking body that really struggles with self-control can even participate and make a meaningful contribution to the broader world. And when I hear stories like that in this thing, I just cry, because I think about, I'm not going to name names because this is the internet, but I think about that little boy who is now he's a man. He's a full-grown man living in a group home for men with autism, and he still doesn't speak. But part of why, I didn't just, she no longer goes to this church, I didn't just run to her and say, oh, you have to listen to this because it'll give you hope. It's the same reason I'm not real quick to run to someone because if I hear a miracle story, because miracle stories are exactly that, they're miracles. And on one hand, if you're the recipient of a really wonderful miracle, it's great. But if you hear all this hope, and these people so often have had their hopes dashed, that maybe through spelling and through, maybe you can connect with your son. Maybe not. Maybe this is just a really small sample. And it's interesting how it's connected with savantism, which is a super interesting dynamic. There was the man who mistook his woman for a hat. I think it was that book. Had the story of savant twins who had this deep engagement, and they were sort of math savants, and they were always together just doing their little math thing, and basically had this deep connection with each other. I'm sure if they did a telepathy thing, they might have been able to find that these two seem to in some ways share a consciousness. But then the courts decided that for the welfare of the children, because they're so bonded with each other, they weren't bonded with other people, the courts separated them. It's a terribly tragic story, and I talked about it in a previous video years ago. And then you just had these two men just working janitorial, separated, alone. And it's like, what kind of monster would separate these two? Okay, I appreciate the fact that you wanted them to be able to connect with a broader society, but no one gave them much hope of being able to have that kind of connection in sort of a speech-centered, common culture way. So beneath this story are families and mothers and fathers and grandparents and teachers and loved ones who know the pain and the sacrifice that goes on here. And for any little glimmer of hope that might say they're communicating. Now, I completely understand that skeptics will want to say, well, that just proves that, just all the more incentive, even if there's no money in it, incentive to just make this whole thing up. Okay, fair enough. And it's wishful thinking, yada, yada, yada. Fine. People are going to have thoughts. But this moment was so interesting.
Not been given much respect, and certainly not money. And Dr. Diane Hennessy Powell has been trying. But there needs to be a ton of research looking into this. And what Manisha says next is classic.
Whoever is asking for data, Akil is a data.
Whoever is looking for data, Akil is the data.
Michael had signaled to me that he needed another battery.
Oh, you need a battery? Run down and get it, because I have to get something too.
When I got to the camera room, Michael had his head in his hands. And if you remember from the first episode, Michael often approaches things skeptically. I would say, and I think Michael would agree, that he doesn't believe in much that can't be measured or explained. And he certainly doesn't put much stock in religion. When he looked up, he said, "Do I have to believe in God now?" Coming from Michael, this was totally out of...
What a fascinating leap. And it just shows sort of the low resolution culture we're in, that, well, God is part of that spooky stuff out there, this certain dualism that's underway. And it's such an interesting leap that, now, I would imagine that these kinds of stories have that impact. And I think that's a lot of what Rod Dreher writes about in his book Living in Wonder, and this whole new fascination with enchantment. But I'm more on the other side of a lot of people saying, yeah, I get it. Because if you can sort of break the materialism, then that leaves an opening for the church, Christianity, and a relationship with God, etc., etc. But it also leaves an opening for a whole lot more. And as with many of the people who've left Christianity, they didn't necessarily become disenchanted. They became selectively disenchanted. And so what is really needed is sort of the long-term faithfulness, preferably on a large scale, that can reconstitute that climate level authority. Because for religious believers who are struggling with something down in the weather level, they lean into the climate level authority. You know, it's so interesting looking at Rod Dreher's story himself. You know, his crisis in Catholicism led him to orthodoxy, which, you know, sort of a lateral move in many ways. And kind of part of the reason the Catholic sex scandals, the priest sex scandals were so devastating is because of how that authority is instantiated in that particular hierarchy. Whereas certainly in Protestantism, you have so many tiny little hierarchies, and they try to instantiate this sort of climate level authority in the Bible or the Holy Spirit or something that isn't quite as fallible as a cardinal or a priest who really shouldn't be there. And maybe that's enough for now. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think.